On July 4, 1776, a group of colonial delegates in Philadelphia approved a document that did more than announce a political separation. It claimed that 13 British colonies were now free and independent states, no longer subject to the authority of the British Crown. Today, the Declaration of Independence is remembered as a founding document of the United States, but at the time, it was also a dangerous act of defiance. The men who supported it were not simply making a philosophical argument. They were declaring themselves outside the protection of the empire and directly challenging King George III. If Britain won the war, the signers could be treated as traitors. That risk gives the declaration much of its drama. It was both a legal statement, a political manifesto, and a moral argument for revolution. The declaration did not appear out of nowhere. By the summer of 1776, the American colonies had already been in open conflict with Britain for more than a year. Fighting began in April 1775 at Lexington and Concord, where tensions between colonial militias and British troops exploded into violence. After that, the conflict became harder to contain. Colonial leaders gathered again in the Continental Congress in Philadelphia on May 10, 1775, trying to coordinate a response. Some still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, but events kept pushing the colonies toward independence. In August 1775, King George III declared the colonies to be in rebellion. That royal proclamation made compromise more difficult. To many colonists, it suggested that the king did not see them as loyal subjects with grievances, but as rebels to be suppressed. The meeting place for this historic decision was the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia, later known as Independence Hall. Inside, delegates from the 13 colonies debated not only strategy for the war, but the basic question of political identity. Were they British subjects defending traditional rights, or were they becoming citizens of new states? This was not a simple or unanimous emotional journey. Independence was radical. It meant cutting ties with one of the most powerful empires in the world. It meant risking trade, security, property, and lives. But as the war continued, the case for independence grew stronger. If Britain considered the colonies to be in rebellion, colonial leaders needed to explain to the world why their rebellion was justified. The Declaration would become that explanation. On June 11, 1776, Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration. It became known as the Committee of Five: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert R. Livingston, and Roger Sherman. Each man brought political experience and credibility, but the actual writing was assigned mostly to Jefferson. John Adams, one of the strongest advocates for independence, encouraged the committee to let Jefferson draft it. Jefferson was known for his skill with language, and the committee needed a document that could persuade, justify, and endure. Between June 11 and June 28, Jefferson composed the original draft. He did not invent every idea in it from nothing. Many principles drew on Enlightenment political thought and colonial arguments about rights. But Jefferson gave those ideas a memorable form, combining philosophy with a direct indictment of British rule. Before Congress adopted the Declaration, it had already taken a decisive step toward independence. On July 2, 1776, Congress passed the Lee Resolution, which declared that the colonies were free and independent states and that Britain no longer had governing authority over them. In a strict legal and political sense, July 2 was the day Congress voted for independence. But July 4 became the date remembered because that was when Congress formally adopted the Declaration explaining the decision. The difference matters. The Lee Resolution made the break. The Declaration gave the break meaning. It told Americans, Britain, and foreign powers why the colonies believed independence was necessary and legitimate. A revolution needs force, but it also needs a story of why the old authority has lost its right to rule. The Declaration's argument begins with a broad claim about human rights and political authority. Its most famous passage says that all men are created equal and are endowed with unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words are among the most quoted in world history because they move beyond the immediate dispute with Britain. They state that government exists to secure rights, and that when a government becomes destructive of those rights, the people have a right to alter or abolish it. This was the moral foundation of the Declaration. The colonists were not, in their own telling, merely unhappy with taxes or policy. They were claiming that legitimate government depends on consent, and that Britain had violated the principles that made government legitimate in the first place. After presenting its principles, the Declaration turns to evidence. It lists a series of grievances against King George III, accusing him of repeated injuries and abuses. In total, the document cites 27 complaints. These include charges that the king interfered with colonial laws, obstructed justice, maintained standing armies in peacetime, imposed taxes without consent, and deprived colonists of trial by jury. The purpose of this list was strategic. The Declaration had to show that independence was not impulsive or reckless. It presented the colonies as patient communities that had suffered a long pattern of abuses and had tried to seek redress. By placing blame on the king, the Declaration framed the conflict as a failure of monarchy. The colonies were not rejecting order itself, they were rejecting a ruler they described as tyrannical. Congress edited Jefferson's draft before approving it. That detail is important because the Declaration was not simply one man's private essay. It was a political document shaped by a collective body. Delegates had to agree on language that could represent all 13 colonies. Some phrases were changed, shortened, or removed. The final version had to be strong enough to justify revolution, but broad enough to hold together a fragile alliance of colonies with different economies, religions, and political cultures. When Congress adopted it unanimously on July 4, the delegates were acting as representatives of each colony. The document's heading on the engrossed copy would later refer to the unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America. Even the phrase United States signaled a new political reality still in formation. Approving the Declaration was not the same as safely winning independence. The Revolutionary War was still underway, and Britain had no intention of accepting the colony's claim just because Congress had written it down. For the delegates, this made the act enormously risky. By supporting and signing the Declaration, they were committing what Britain considered high treason against the Crown, a crime that could be punished severely, even by death. This danger is part of why the final line is so memorable. The signers pledged to each other their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. That was not decorative language. It recognized that political principles would now have to be defended through war, sacrifice, and uncertainty. The Declaration transformed colonial protest into a point of no return. Once adopted, the Declaration had to be distributed. On July 6, 1776, it was published by the Pennsylvania Evening Post. 2 days later, on July 8 at noon, public readings took place in several designated locations, including Philadelphia, Trenton, and Easton. These readings mattered because many people would encounter the Declaration not as a framed museum artifact, but as spoken words in public space. News traveled through newspapers, broadsides, and crowds. One of the first printed versions was the Dunlap broadside, produced for rapid distribution. 2 original Dunlap copies are now preserved at the Library of Congress. In 1776, however, their purpose was immediate communication. Congress needed soldiers, citizens, and foreign observers to understand that the colonies were no longer merely protesting. They were declaring themselves independent. The version most people imagine today is the signed parchment copy displayed at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. But that copy was not the first printed announcement. After adoption, Congress ordered an engrossed, or carefully handwritten, copy on July 19, 1776. It was prepared by Timothy Matlack and signed primarily on August 2. This helps explain why the signing scene is often misunderstood. The Declaration was adopted on July 4, but the famous signed document was created and signed later. Over time, that parchment became the symbolic official version, carrying the names of the delegates who publicly attached themselves to the cause. Its faded ink and large signatures now make it feel almost sacred, but it began as a practical record of a revolutionary decision. The Declaration's influence did not end with the revolution. Its words became a standard by which Americans argued about the meaning of their own country. Abraham Lincoln saw the Declaration as the moral foundation of the United States. For him, the Constitution had to be interpreted in light of the Declaration's principle that all men are created equal. During the Civil War, Lincoln returned to that idea in the Gettysburg Address, describing the nation as conceived in liberty and dedicated to equality. In doing so, he treated the Declaration not merely as a historical announcement, but as an unfinished promise. That is why the document remains powerful. It declared independence in 1776, but its claims about rights, equality, and legitimate government have continued to challenge every generation that inherited them. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.